Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this tutorial, we're going to start one of the many Sim Settlements toolkits that we have released, and this is going to start with the very basics. So this particular tutorial does assume that you understand either the kit bashing in the earlier CK tutorial, or that you are coming prepared with your own models, or you're going to build exclusively with vanilla models to make your building plan. Now, some of you are probably immediately thinking, I have no interest in building Sim Settlements stuff, so I don't need to do this tutorial. And I would advise against that. I would actually suggest strongly that everybody who's going through my series go through anything flagged as Sim Settlements as well, because we'll end up touching on a lot of random things that aren't directly related or required of Sim Settlements. So you'll learn a lot of new shortcuts, hotkeys, how different form types work. There's just so much stuff you're going to pick up just doing the exercises. Even if you have no interest in releasing, say, an add-on pack for Sim Settlements, you're just going to learn a lot by going through this. So we touch on all sorts of random things, and as I continue to develop Sim Settlements and we add more content to it, we'll extend the number of features that we're touching, and then it makes it even more likely that things that we do in these Sim Settlements tutorials end up being relevant to you guys. Now, if you did come here specifically because you've been wanting a video Sim Settlements tutorial series for making add-on packs, well, this is going to be a great start for you, but you will still want to use the toolkits that we have in PDF form. Those are available on Nexus. They will be linked below. This is kind of going to be auxiliary material to those. I will definitely go into all of the detail eventually, but it will take me a while, and so your fallback is going to be those PDF tutorials so that you can get the extra information you're missing. The other place you can get information is we do have a Discord set up specifically to help people learn how to mod, and we have a lot of help for people looking to make add-on packs, so you have that resource available as well. All right, so that's enough prelude, so let's get into the good stuff. So to start, this is going to assume you do have Sim Settlements installed, as you're going to need that in your data folder in order to do this first step. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to load up Sim Settlements into the creation kit. So you're going to find simsettlements.esm in your data screen here. You're going to double click it so it gets activated and press OK. And then of course we wait the normal absurd amount of time for the creation kit to load, and so we'll pause and come back here after that's done. All right, so we are loaded up in the creation kit. I've got Sim Settlements loaded in to this. Now, one of the things if you went through the kit bashing tutorial, you'll know that I suggest setting up a building stage somewhere you can build on. And I'm basically going to quickly just rough out a building. I'm not going to go into heavy detail on what I'm doing. All of that's covered in the CK102 tutorial, but I do want to point out some things that are specific to plot design and some benefits you can get when working in Sim Settlements. First of all, I already have a stage set up called KG Sim Building Stage in the interior cells that you can make use of, because when you make your own add-on pack, it doesn't matter if you have stuff in here, since it never gets used in the actual game by Sim Settlements, so it doesn't matter if you're actually overwriting this, so it's not a big deal. So I'm going to operate out of that to save a little time, and as I advised in that other tutorial, we are going to build ourselves a new layer. I'm going to start this as KG test, and we're going to call this test building 01, and that's our new layer. We're going to make it active by clicking that A. And then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add an object to that, and we need something called the alignment helper. This is something that, again, is in Sim Settlements, and the purpose of it is to help you know where the boundaries of a plot are, because players find it kind of a nuisance if your buildings go too far outside, because then it makes it really hard for them to plan. So what you'll do is, I typed in alignment in the filter to make it quicker to find. You're going to expand world objects and click on static in the object window, and you'll find that there are a bunch of these objects that start with the words K, or the prefix KG Sim alignment helper. So there are a few different ones you can use here depending on the type of plot you're working on. I tend to work on 2x2s. I find that to be a great amount of space and the most useful, because that plot, or the 2x2 type, is available for all of the different plot classes. So there are two different ones here to look at. This test one you can ignore. That is for something that I'm working on in the future of Sim Settlements that may or may not ever come to fruition. So the two you'd be interested in are going to be the regular ones and the flat ones, and you'll see that they are available for 1x1, 2x2, and 3x3. And then there's also the alignment helper interior for those of you looking to build interior designs. So I'm going to just show you one of these ones that has a flat and non-flat version so you understand what the difference is. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag one of these on here, and it's going to be filling up my screen. And if you don't see this exact thing, there's a couple of things that might be going on. Some of you might see this whole window being black like this, and that means your lighting is turned off. You just press that A key to turn that back on. And some of you may not see this at all. That could be that your markers are hidden, and pressing the M key will will reveal those. So that's just a reminder of some of those hotkeys from earlier tutorials. All right, so the first thing we want to do with our alignment helper is position it at 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So what I just did there is I double clicked on my item, and that's going to bring up the editor window. And this is where you can change a lot of details about this specific object here. So we're going to change these positions to 0, 0, 0. Now, if you don't see this specific screen here, there's a chance it opened up one of these other tabs up here. And if you don't see the tab 3D data, start clicking on these arrows that are up in this upper right-hand corner here until you go all the way to the left, and 3D data should be one of the first couple there. So we're going to enter in 0 for X. And what I'm doing right now, if you see I'm not moving my mouse, I'm using the tab key to tab between these different numbers. And we're going to get it at 0, 0, 0. It just makes one of the later steps very, very easy if you do everything at 0, 0, 0. So this is what I highly recommend. Now we're going to click on this item, hold the shift key, and move around. Again, I am not going to go over all of these types of hotkeys all the time. Just so definitely go through my earlier tutorials if you ever catch me doing something that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I tend to, in the earliest videos, go over an intense amount of detail about everything I'm clicking on. So once you've got your alignment helper in and it's at 0, 0, 0, you're essentially ready to build a sim settlements plot. And now I'm not going to go over all the specifics of this. This is covered in the kit bashing. What I really wanted to show you was that you use this alignment helper as a way to make sure that you're using the space the player anticipates. And now I want to show you the difference between the flat and regular types. So I'm going to go ahead and leave my alignment helper object window open. If you need a new object window, right click here and hit create new object window. It lets you have multiple of these open so you can search around and find stuff. So I'm going to just show you what happens when you drop an item onto this alignment helper, because that's the best way to explain this. So I'm going to type in workshop asterisk floor, the asterisk being a wild card, so it finds anything that's similar to that. And I'm going to click on static under world objects to bring up some floor pieces that I'm very familiar with. So we're going to go ahead and grab this shack mid floor, which is a standard wood floor you use in workshop mode, and just drag it on here, just so you can see kind of what it looks like. So if you look right now, it looks kind of faded, and that's because it kind of is inside of the alignment helper. Now, if I look underneath, you'll see that it's poking through just a little bit. And this is all by design. The idea here is that if you place them on this normal alignment helper, so not the flat one, the actual bottom of the alignment helper here, that is what's going to sit on the foundation that the player attaches their plot to. So the nice thing is that the floors will sink in just a little so they can handle a little bit of overlap or floatiness, and they kind of settle in nicely. And then the sitting up top here will be nicely above the plot, so that when you get to the nav mesh stuff, which we're not going to cover in this tutorial, we'll cover that in a future one, but when you get to the nav mesh stuff, it'll work nicely because the nav mesh of your building will be just above the plot. So that's the benefit of using the original alignment helper, is when you're going to use floors, you can just drop them on there and you know they will be at the correct height, and then you just build everything else on top of it. If you're not using floors, well, you can end up with floatiness unless you understand that you should be aligning with the bottom of this guy, and that's very counterintuitive unless, like I said, you're dropping floors on there. So if you're not using floors, you might want to use the flat helper. So now I'm going to place the flat helper, and I'll show you what it looks like to drop a floor onto that. So we're going to grab this 2x2 flat, drag it in, double click it, get these all set to 0 once again, and then we'll use our other object window and just drop this guy on there. So now what you'll see is that instead this thing is all the way through and just the top sticking up. So now if you were to use this as your building, your entire floor would be sunk into the ground of the plot, because the flat alignment helper, this is also going to lay flush against the foundation the player placed. So as you can see, that means this entire thing would be under the ground. It would be underneath the foundation. So you got to be aware of that. If you decide to use the flat one, you should move your items up a little bit so that they're sitting on top of it. If you're using the regular one and you're using floors, you can just drop them on and they will be perfectly positioned up and down. So that's just what I wanted to show you real quick with the alignment helper. This is, otherwise, it's mostly just a tool. It allows you to ensure that you're not going outside the borders. And for those of you who went through the kit bashing, you'll also be familiar with the static pivot, the static collection pivot dummy, and I might have those words jumbled around, but you should know what I'm talking about. This thing can also act like that during the static collection phase if you make sure it's the last thing you select. And I'll show you that. I'm going to rough out a building really, really fast here. So I'm not even going to go over the steps of what I'm doing. If you want to know that, go through the kit bashing tutorial, and that will kind of talk to you about what it is that I'm actually doing here. And I'm just going to kind of build something really rudimentary, because the point of this is not to show you the buildings necessarily. It is to show you how to get some settlements plot up and running. So I want to be able to get a building into some settlements basically as quickly as possible. And so for that, I just want to build something very rudimentary. So we're going to just continue to plop these things down. It's just going to be a very basic boxy house, nothing fancy here. And we just need ourselves a little doorway. And this little trick that I'm doing right now is incredibly useful. I think I've mentioned it in other videos, but I will mention it again, is you click a piece and you hold the Alt key and then scroll your mouse wheel, and you can quickly jump between a bunch of different piece types. And it's very useful for quickly getting something that's functional. So as you can see, I've already built a box house that took me approximately 40 seconds. I might be off on that time, but it didn't take long. And I've got a real basic building, and we can actually use this in some settlements. So we're going to go ahead and create a static collection here, and here's the step I wanted to show you guys. So in normal cases, you would grab everything, and if you had that pivot dummy, it would automatically become your origin. To ensure this alignment helper becomes your origin, you're just going to hold Control while you got everything selected, click on the alignment helper so it gets deselected, and then click it once more. And that way it becomes the very last item selected, and that gets used as your origin, unless you have a static collection pivot dummy, which you can still use with these, but this just happens to serve the same purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and use it as long as it's the last thing you select. So we're going to go ahead and create our static collection, and we'll name this kg test house 01, and then I'm going to suffix it with scall, because we're going to do a different step that we didn't cover in depth in the kit bashing tutorial that is much more relevant for the way Sim Settlements works. So with Sim Settlements, generally we need these buildings to be nav meshed, because we want the NPCs to be able to walk around in them and not just collide into the walls. And that requires that these actually be model files and not just static collections. So static collections, one of the disadvantages to them is they can't be nav meshed. Now, like I said, we're not going to cover nav meshing in this particular tutorial, but I do want you to be aware of why we're about to do this extra step. So this extra step is something I believe I've shown you the button, but didn't go into detail of how we handle it. So what we're going to do is open up our static collection, and you can see I just filtered for it to bring it up based on what I just named it. We're going to hit recreate NIF from data. And now this is going to create a file that is essentially a model file with this in it, with what we're seeing here at this location. And this is going to be inside of your Fallout 4 data and then meshes folder. You'll find that. So we're going to go ahead and bring open a folder here, and let's try not to show off all of my my computer stuff here, and hopefully keep some privacy. We might need to black out some of this while I'm talking, but basically what you want to do is get into your Fallout 4 data folder. One of the things I do is I keep a shortcut right to the Fallout 4 directory on my desktops, just so it's quicker and easier to access. And we're going to go into meshes and then static collection, and then it created this none folder. Normally, once you've saved your plugin, it will actually create a folder named after your plugin, but because I haven't saved yet, it does not do that. So then what we're going to do is, once we found this .nif file, which will be named exactly as it is in here, you can see it ends in FA3, as does this one. I'm going to go ahead and cut this out of here. So I'm going to hit cut, which will just basically, it's be a copy paste, but it won't be left behind here. We're going to go into our meshes folder. And here we're going to create our own directory. So generally, this is just a good habit to get into so that you can keep your files more organized. So I'm going to create a directory called kg-test, which we are going to use for storing our model files. Now, you'd probably want to do some, bury some files under here so that bury some folders under here rather, so that it's as nicely organized as you build out your add-on pack. But because we're just doing a test, it's not super important. So I'm just going to call this building test 01, and we're going to call this level 1. So this will be our level 1 of the building. So for those of you not super familiar with sim settlements, it generally works on the idea of each of your buildings having 3 distinct levels, and then you might have some stages in between, which we're not going to go into for this particular tutorial. We'll go over that in another one. So we've got our building test level 1, and I have this set up so that I can double click on NIF files and open those up in NIFscope. If you're not familiar with setting up default programs or with NIFscope, we'll cover NIFscope in a future video. It's also covered in the first getting started guide in the builder's toolkit for sim settlements if you're interested in learning some of that basics. But it's just a very cool community built piece of software that lets you view NIF files. I will go into some training on NIFscope in future videos, but it does allow you to pop open and confirm that you do have the correct model and that it is aligned nicely. So I'm able to confirm that without having to load it into the creation kit, which can be kind of slow. All right, so now we've got our model done. So now we're going to do the next step. So this is the step where we didn't really talk about in the kit bashing. So what I'm going to do is go under World Objects, click on Static. I'm going to right click here and hit New. And I'm going to go ahead and give my new static name. So we're going to name this exactly the same as our static collection there, except without the scall prefix. Excuse me, my voice just cracked there. And then we're going to give it a display name. This isn't strictly necessary, but one of the things that I advise in the Builder's Toolkit is that you provide scrap records for all of your objects. So that way, if the player has a problem with your add-on for some reason, or if for some reason a plot gets screwed up for whatever number of reasons, could be the scripts in a player's save game go nuts, they can end up with items left behind. There's a mod that I've put out called Sim Settlements Helper, and all it is just construction records for everything in sim settlements for the sake of scrapping. They're not buildable. It just allows you to scrap them, so that way people can clean up a mess if it gets left behind. This is especially useful on console if you're releasing on Xbox, because they have the disadvantage of not being able to run the disable console command to clean up things that get left behind. So we're going to just go ahead and put an arbitrary display name here. And now we're skipping a couple of steps that you might find in the Builder's Toolkit, and that's okay. We're just trying to streamline this process. I am going to veer off a little bit from the Builder's Toolkit for a variety of reasons. For one, I've just learned a lot since I wrote that, so there are some steps I've learned that are not necessary or aren't strictly necessary at this stage of your learning, and so it's just not going to be useful to you. So we'll come back and cover a lot of that stuff if it's still relevant today. And so you'll notice what I did there is I clicked edit and I navigated to the new NIF file that I created, and you'll see it shows up nicely here, and then we just hit OK, and here it is. And then we're going to press OK once more. And now we have our static record. So this can now be nav meshed, which means it will be great for use with sim settlements. So again, we're not going to cover that in this particular tutorial. I just wanted to show you guys how to take that kit bashing stuff you learned in that earlier tutorial and turn them into the statics necessary to do stuff with sim settlements. Now, there is a way to use static collections with sim settlements, but it does involve some Xedit scripting, so it's a little too advanced for this particular tutorial, and we'll cover that in a future video. And there is a tutorial included with the Builder's Toolkit on how you can do that. One caveat to that is you generally don't want to do that for the actual levels. You can do it for the building stages that lead to the levels that are just kind of look like an animation to the player. But the reason you don't want to use the static collections as your actual levels that will exist in the settlement is because of that nav mesh issue I mentioned. So if you just use the static collections, they can't be nav meshed, and the NPCs will navigate them terribly, and players tend to find that pretty obnoxious. So right, we've now got our static here, so now we can get into the sim settlement specific. So that all could be useful outside of it. It can sometimes be useful to have these statics for other reasons. Maybe even if you don't need a nav mesh, maybe you want to do some tweaks to it in some way. But that's how you take a static collection and convert it into a generic static. All right, so let's go ahead and set up our first sim settlements building plan. So what you're going to do is go under the items category. You're going to click on MISC item. And you're going to filter for KGSim template or asterisk template to make sure you find them all. And you'll find that I tend to try and include in sim settlements a template version of all the different record types that we use. And this is a little trick here. So this using MISC items as kind of data holders, it lets us avoid certain data limitations in the creation engine. So they have array limits of 128. And what I found is that we can use a combination of a thing called form lists, which we may have briefly gone over them excuse me, in a previous tutorial. I don't believe so, but I'm not double checking all of the older tutorials when I go through these. I'd rather re-explain stuff than risk leaving some of you behind. So what we do is we can take form lists and put as many of these miscellaneous items and we want, and we just treat these as like a data entry of an array. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. This is going to be useful. People who are programmers will know what I'm talking about. But essentially, there is a 128 arbitrary limit within the creation engine for something, and by using these misc objects, it's kind of a way for us to bypass that. And that's why we use these for building plans, because as many of you know who play Sim Settlements, there are thousands of building plans available now. So the 128 limit would have been very discouraging. So this now is a way for us to get around that we built in from the get-go. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to take this KG Sim building plan template, and you're going to right click it, and you're going to hit duplicate. And then you're going to end up with this KG Sim building plan template copy with 4 zeros at the end. So now you're going to double click that. And the first thing we do whenever we're doing something new, and we could have done this by just opening the building plan template first, and then just renaming. The problem with that method, and I tend to use both, the problem with that method, and even I make this mistake, is occasionally you'll start editing all the other fields. So let's just show you for example. So say let's say you opened this up with the intention of knowing that once you were done editing, as long as you changed to this ID field, it would create a new record for you automatically. Well, if instead you just started editing all these fields and pressed OK, you would have overwritten the original record instead of creating a new record, and you might not even notice. And I have definitely done that myself. So it's definitely safer to duplicate, rename, and then when you get the prompt at the end after you press OK, just say no to create a new record because you already did, and say yes to rename. So we're going to go ahead and name this KG test. We'll call this building plan 01. And now there's some of these fields, what you'll find in these templates that I have set up are set up in a way to where you're kind of doing a fill in the blank. So building plan name. So what do you want to call your building plan essentially? And I'm sure you've seen this if you hit view plaque in Sim Settlements, but essentially this lets you show your name and a name for the building in the game so players can figure out who actually built each thing. This is something that was really important to me to make sure that people get recognition for the work they've done and that it's not just assumed that the Sim Settlements team did everything, since there's so much community created content. So this is how you get credit for your work. One thing that we've started doing that wasn't in this template originally is we've all started to put in brackets a little prefix that represents our particular add-on pack name so that people can see all of them in a group. And so that's a nice thing to do. So I'll call this KGT as KG test. Not that I'm going to release this or anything, but just to show you what it might look like. So you can come up with 2 to 4 letters that would represent what your add-on pack is going to be. Again, I'm assuming here if you're going to put this much effort in that you're going to release an add-on pack saying that. But if you don't care, if you're just going along these examples just for the sake of learning random bits, then it doesn't really matter what you put in here. And then you name your building. So we're going to call this test house like we've been calling it. And then you replace the word author with your name or whatever name you want to show up to players to figure out which is you. So that's the first step. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK here. And then I'll show you what I was talking about. See right here, since I already created a copy, I don't need to create a new object. So I can just say no and say yes to the rename. And then you'll see that mine disappeared from here because, well, it's disappeared from this template section. It's actually right down here. But sometimes you would find that after you did that, your version wouldn't be here because you had a filter on, and you might have to filter for the new editor ID that you used. So it can be hit or miss in the way that the creation kit will decide to handle those filters. So now I'm going to take this moment to go ahead and save my plugin. So we're going to call this 101 test add-on. And so that's the first stage there. So now there's a few more things we're going to do here. First, we're going to set up this building plan to just generate our object, and then I'm going to show you a couple little more steps in there to make it feel a little more Sim Settlements-y. Because right now, if I were to show you how to do what I'm about to show you, is going to feel very much like a more complicated version of just setting up the constructible objects, which we covered in the CK 104, 103 video about building workshop objects. So right now, this is basically no different than a workshop object. So there are some things we'll need to do to make this actually feel worthy of a Sim Settlements building. So first off, let's set this up to work so that we can actually get this into the game. So you'll see when you open up your building plan record that there's a script attached to it already called Sim Settlements Sim Building Plan. So if you double click on that, you'll bring up the property screen. Now, there are a ton of properties in here, especially if you expand this advanced thing, but we're not going to cover those in this particular video. In fact, it's going to take a while before we cover all of the different things in the advanced, but we will eventually. But I'm going to tell you the only things you absolutely need to have filled out to make a building work are level stops and stage models. The other things here are optional, though highly, highly recommended. So we are going to set them all up here for the sake of thoroughness on making sure you understand how to set up a basic building plan. But just, you know, that they, at the core level, they are very, very simple to get going here. So the first thing we're going to do is go to stage models. So if we double click on that, you're going to get this fun form, which one of the things prefix here is that this particular stage steps, these particular steps are a little bit slow. Okay, they're a lot slow. And we do have ways to get around this by using Xedit. Again, we'll cover that in future videos, but just don't be discouraged by the speed here because you will have a way around it. But it is nice to learn this way so you understand what it is you're doing with the particular Xedit scripts when we get to that stage, because there is a little bit of prep work you do before you fill these out with the Xedit scripts. And the scripts, again, that sounds intimidating. It's not. It's very, very easy. You'll see when we get to those, but just know that this is slow right now, but you won't have to do it forever. So the first thing we're going to do, and where the speed issue comes in, is after you select the form type here, that takes a while for the next window to load. So we're going to go into form type, and we're going to go down and choose static. So what we're setting up here is the models that SimSettlements will display over time. So if you're familiar with SimSettlements, you know that what happens is after you select a building plan, some building materials appear on the ground, and then after somebody's assigned and the scaffolding appears to start construction with the noises and everything, basically what it does is it will go through one by one each of the entries and display each of those models, and it spreads it out over a period of time depending on whether the player is using realistic build times or not, and it'll keep juggling through those models until it gets to the final level model. So essentially what you're doing here is picking out the order of models that are going to appear for the player. So it gives a kind of a simulation of them building over time. Now we're going to do it the short way since we only have our level. We didn't do the stages. All we're going to do here is set up our building materials, and then we're going to set up it to go right to this level. So for building materials, you can make your own, and generally building materials, if you're familiar with SimSettlements, just are piles of lumber and metal and things, and we've got a whole bunch of those. Well, not a whole bunch. We've got a handful of those already built, so I'm going to show you what those look like. So if you search for KG Sim, say materials, that should be a good search term. You'll see these ones that start with building materials, and I'll just pop one open so you can get an idea what it looks like. And you can see that it's, you know, just a pile of planks and some fence and bricks and things like that. And you can use whatever of these ones you want, or you can create your own. And they're just a way to show that, you know, the building isn't built yet. It's just there as remnants of one. So we're gonna go ahead and do a filter here. And again, so you can see this is one of those things where it takes a few seconds to load up. It's a little bit slow. And we're not going to have to deal with that forever. So we're going to then come down here. We're going to just go ahead and use the one we just showed. I believe it was the concrete fence and wood. And that will be our building material. So that's what's going to show up when this building plan is applied to the plot, but it hasn't started building yet. So before anybody is assigned. So then we're going to go ahead and hit add. We're going to choose static once again from this form type. And now once this loads up, we're going to go ahead and find this building that we just made. So one of the things you'll notice here is that static collection isn't one of the options here. And again, we found out that that's something we can get around through using Xedit scripts, but because it's not available in the creation kit, the converting your scalls into these statics is very important if you're going to exclusively work within the creation kit, which some add-on pack authors do. Not everybody uses the Xedit script method because it is intimidating, but like I said, once you see me do it, you'll see how easy it really is. So that'll be in a future tutorial. So I'm going to just filter on KG test since I know that's what my prefix is, and here we'll find our test house. So there we go. So now we've got the bare minimum you would need to get a building plan working, and you'll notice that I don't have multiple levels, and that is supported by SimSettlements. It can go anywhere from 1 to 3 levels. It doesn't require all 3, though players expect it. So you would definitely, if you're planning on making an add-on and you want people to enjoy it, you're going to want to put the 3 levels in there. I know there are a few plugins out there that do just have single or double level plot buildings, and people tend to complain about those quite a bit. Those end up coming up in bug reports quite often. So just know that you should probably build all 3 of the levels. Otherwise, again, if you're only going to build 1 level, then there's not really a big real reason to use SimSettlements in that case. You might as well just make it a constructible workshop object. All right, so the next step is teaching sim settlements which of these entries represents each of your levels. So you need to tell it that the particular model that represents, for example, the level 1 building, because you could have as many of these in between that just represented construction stages, and sim settlements doesn't assume anything, so you've got to teach it. So that's what we use this level stops field for. So in this case, we know that our entry here is our level 1. And so we just look at this number right here. And you'll notice that the first number is a 0. This is a very common thing in computers to use 0 base as a counter. So the first entry is actually a 0. But not fortunately for our sake, we have this nice column here to help us. So we look to the left of the model we want as our level 1. And in this case, it's the number 1. And we enter that as our first level stop. So we're going to double click level stops, click add, and we're going to enter the number 1. So if you had multiple levels, so if you had, say you had multiple buildings here, you would just look at the number next to each of whatever one was your level, and you would punch that into the level stop. So at the end, if you're building a standard sim settlements building, you would end up with 3 entries under level stops. So now we're going to go ahead and hit OK, and we're going to hit OK again. Now at this point, if we save here, we could load this into the game and we could put it on a sim settlements plot and it would absolutely work. But I'm going to go ahead and set up a couple of more things so you can see again, so that why you would use sim settlements and not just a constructible object. And that's because of things like the clutter or the fact that you can make this spawn furniture and things like that. So we're going to do some of that. We're also going to set up our message so that players can actually see that we were the ones that built it. So we're going to go, we've already got KGSim template highlighted there. So we're going to take advantage of that. We're going to scroll down to miscellaneous and we're going to click on message. And you should find a building info template. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate this. Just like we've been doing, double click this to open it up. And now this one looks quite messy and intimidating, but it's really just giving you a lot of helpful hints about how you could set this up. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and rename this. So we're going to go ahead and leave the building info word there. So I'm just going to change the prefix to KG test. I'm going to get rid of this template stuff at the end, and we'll call this building plan 01. All right, so this right here, the title field, if you were to go into sim settlements and view the plaque, there is below at the top, it will say designer details, which will have that information we showed before. So let me bring up the building plan just so that we can talk about it on screen here. So let's bring up our building plan. So on the plaque at the top, you would have designer details, and that would show this stuff, the name you have for your building plan. Then below that, it will have a note field, and whatever you put in here will appear in that note field. So it's a great way for you to put a little extra information to the player in some cases. You can also leave it blank, in which case it will just say NA there. I'm going to just put test note just so you guys can see it when we get into the game. Next up is where you would put information that the player would get when they selected your building plan. So if you've played a lot of sim settlements, you'll know that one of the things you tend to do is set up the specific building plans you want by accessing the little sensor on the plot. And this is the message that players will see. And this allows you to give them information about who built the plot, maybe some details about how they might place it. It's totally up to you what you do here. Because most of the sim settlements stuff tends to fit nicely in the boxes, we don't really worry about placement too much. So we just tend to use this as kind of a flavor description, or we might use it to describe the resources you gain if it's an specialized industrial plot or something. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end of here of my building plan stuff and copy it. And see, so it's built similar to the way the other template was, where you're just meant to kind of fill in these blanks. So we're going to change building name to test house, and then by kinggath. So I just copied that all, so I'm going to paste it in. And then from is where you can do your add-on pack name. So we'll just do from 101 test add-on. And again, it's totally up to you. There's nothing requiring anything here. The only thing you absolutely have to leave alone on this particular form is leave these buttons as is, because Sim Settlements is expecting the build this and cancel buttons to be exactly there, and that is a message box type. But what you put in here is totally up to you. This is just a suggestion of some things you might do. For example, it says repeat plaque extra info field, and that's suggesting you copy the title there, so that if that note is more than just flavor and it's actually relevant, that the player gets that information as well. It's not strictly necessary that you do that, but that's a common thing thing you might do. So the other things here are benefits and costs. This is especially useful for the advanced industrial type plots where in Industrial Revolution, where we were applying bonuses and penalties to them. It's nice to let the player know before they make that decision. In this case, we're using a very basic house, so I'm going to just go ahead and erase all this. We don't need anything in particular. It's just our test building, so we don't need anything there. But if you were going to add more information for the player, it looks nicer if you leave a blank line there and then just type in basic test house or whatever. Just describe it however you like in a way that will help the player inform their decision about whether they're going to build this or not. And I'll just leave that basic test house in, as that's fine. Then we're going to hit OK. Once again, since we started with a duplicate object, we don't want to create a new one. And then we'll press yes to the rename. And now we've got our building info. So now we can come back into our record here, our KG Test Building Plan 01, open up those properties, and we're going to go to Extra Plaque Info, and we're going to assign that message we just created. And there we go. So now we've got two things down. This test plan only, you'll basically never use that. That's just set up so that people who have established add-on packs who don't want to have to delay releasing a patch for something. Let me back up. So say you have an add-on pack that's out in public, people are using it, and you find a bug in your add-on pack and you need to patch. But you have a building that you've been testing that's incomplete and you don't want it to show up for players. You can check this in to make sure that the players don't ever get that, and that it has to be set up manually through console commands, which I'll show you in a few minutes when we get in the game. But that's what that's for. So you're almost never going to use that. So primarily you'll be using these four fields when you're starting out. All right, so now we've got our extra plaque info. So the last one we're going to do is stage item spawns. But before we do that, we need to set up some things that we're going to spawn. So what a stage item spawn are all those little extra items. So whether or not you're familiar with Sim Settlements, basically after this building gets to the appropriate level, it will then place some other items. So maybe it'll place a bed, maybe it places some random clutter, some furniture, things like that. That is a stage item spawn. So it allows you to spawn extra items at any particular stage in the Sim Settlements placement code. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the bare minimum here. We're going to just put a bed here so that our little house functions as a bed. You can put as many items as you want in here. You could put, say maybe we want to put a door in there. We want to put a bunch of little clutter and things. I would recommend that if you're going to put a bunch of clutter that's static, that you would just use a static collection, just like you did for this. You use that kit bashing and you turn it into a static and do it that way. If you have hundreds or even dozens of little items in there, it can really bog down people's systems. Whereas if they're all a combined model file, like a kit bashed, it will run a lot smoother. All right, so we're going to go ahead and place a bed here. So we're going to go into the World Objects Furniture category. And for the sake of Sim Settlements, it's best to use the beds that are prefixed with KG Sim. I will likely in another tutorial show you the different types. And you don't want to use these ones called player beds. So there's these ones down here. You'll see that they have Workshop, NPC bed. These are the safest ones that you can use. And these will work great. If you want to learn how to make others and you're not willing to wait for more tutorials, go check out the Builder's Toolkit. That should be covered in there. And if not, we can definitely teach you on our Discord. So I'm going to just grab an arbitrary bed here, and we're going to drag it in and just stick it somewhere that seems nice in our tiny little crappy house. We'll go ahead and spin this around and ignore the fact that the blue guy's there. I can't recall if that's set up like that, then likely we have a little bug in Some Settlements and you'd see people spun around. So I don't know if that's an actual bug or not. I'm going to assume it's not for now for the sake of this tutorial, but generally those guys should be laying correctly in there. So it might be that that's misconfigured, but don't worry about it for this particular case. All right, so we've got our bed in there. And now all we have to do is tell our building plan that we want that bed there. So there's a couple of things we got to do. So first we're going to double click this to bring up the information on this particular item so that we can get this information and teach it to Sim Settlement. So we're going to open up both of these forms simultaneously. So we double clicked on our bed to bring up the details about how it's positioned. And we double clicked our building plan so that we can bring that up. And then we're going to go into the script properties, go under stage item spawns and double click that. And then we're going to hit add. And this is another one of those stages where it's slow and it's tedious, but once you understand what it is you're actually doing, then when you get to the point where you understand and have the knowledge to do the script method through Xedit, it'll all make sense. It's very quick and easy, and it saves you a ton of time, especially when you get into complex buildings where you do have a reason to put in dozens of items here. But essentially all we're going to do is fill out some of these fields. So there's only so many we actually need to fill out. So we're going to fill out any of these that aren't 0 of these 6, position and rotation. So we're going to go ahead and just grab this. So we'll just highlight over this. This is one of those points where it's tricky in the creation kit. Normally I like to just do Control C and then you would come over here and press Control V. One of the problems with that is if for some reason your mouse is not aligned over there as that cursor and you hit Control C, it won't actually copy anything and you could end up putting the wrong data into the wrong field. So it's safer to just right click and hit copy here. If you get fast and good at it, you'll learn slowly to just hold your cursor steady while you hit Control C. So essentially we want to set up the positions as offsets. So the idea here is that when so we know right now that our plot building here is at 0, 0, 0, right? Because we placed the alignment helper at 0, 0, 0. So we know that the bed needs to be placed at relevant to that plot where it needs to be placed. It needs to be placed negative 92 units from on the X from the center. It needs to be placed 128 units from the center on Y. And essentially, the SimSettlements does a bunch of trigonometry in game to convert that information so that it works no matter where the player places their plot. And so that's why we call those offsets, because it's offset from wherever the plot actually is placed. Otherwise, I would have just probably called those position. That might have been easier for linking up, but in a technical terminology there, and that probably offset isn't even correct. That's just what I came up with. There's probably some mathematical term I should be using there. But anyway, we're going to copy the position data to the offsets. So you don't have to do anything that's 0. So like when we get to the rotation, we can skip the X and Y. But if it's not a 0, you're going to need to copy that in. So we're going to copy our position here, and we're going to go into offset X and paste it in with Control V. And we're going to grab our Y. One thing weird to note is you'll notice that I double click to grab that. If you do that with a negative number, it actually doesn't grab the negative symbol, which is a real pain in the butt. So you pretty much got to get used to doing the drag. Like I said, it's a little tedious, but once you get exactly what we're doing and understanding, then you'll be able to skip all these steps in the future. So we'll do our offset Z. And then we can skip X and Y rotation, but we do need our Z rotation because it's not 0. And so then we'll go to rotation Z and we'll paste that in there. And then if you had scaled your item, which we didn't, we want the bed to be at full scale so that the people don't look weird on it. You would, if this was not 1, you would need to copy that as well into the F scale field. But because it's a 1, that means that it's at normal 1-to-1 scale. You don't need to change anything. So you can ignore that field. So that's the start there. So we've got the pertinent data we need off of this particular thing here. I am going to leave this open for this last step here. So there's a lot of fields here. Most of them are optional. You don't need a ton of these fields. There are 2 more that we're going to absolutely need. So number 1 is we're going to need our stage number. So this tells SimSettlements when should this appear. Now, how do you know what stage number to use? Well, it depends on what you're doing. Generally for the bed, it's going to be, you're going to need some sort of bed all the time on a plot, because if players are playing with the build times, the long realistic build times, it can take like a day and a half before the bed is actually placed otherwise if you only put it at the levels. But we're not going to get into that for this particular tutorial. That's something very SimSettlement specific. I just want to show you how to set these up for this particular level. So all we're going to do is set up one of these items so that it appears when the plot hits level 1. So the stage num is the same information that we've been putting into these level stops. So for our level 1, if we want something to appear there, this is our stage. So when we look at the stage models, this number here, that corresponds to the actual stage number. So we can use that exact same information to make sure that our individual objects appear at the same time. So if we had 6 entries here and the 6th one was our level 3 building and we wanted to place some extra items at level 3, we know that we would use whatever number was here on that 6th entry, which would be a 5 because we start at 0. So it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That may be confusing for you. So if you don't like looking or thinking about an example that doesn't have the visual on screen, in our case, let's just do exactly what we're about to do. Let's talk about it from that perspective. We want our level 1, the test house 01, we want that to have a bed. So we know we need to use this 1 as our stage. So we're going to go back into stage item spawns. We'll double click this first one here. We'll go down to stage num and we'll type in the number 1. So now we know when the building gets to stage 1, And that has to do with these stage models, that it's going to also create this bed here. So the last thing we need to do is tell it what the bed is. So right now you can see all this information. All it is a stage number and a bunch of position data, but we don't actually tell some settlements yet what they're supposed to spawn. So that's what this form to spawn is for. There's also a way you can do it with external stuff, but that's more advanced than we want to cover for here. So for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to use this form to spawn field. Now we know that we found the bed under the furniture category, so that's the type we're going to select. And if you weren't sure about that, there's a couple of ways you could figure that out. One is, since we have this open, you could click Edit Base. And once that opens at the top left corner, it'll tell you the form type that you've actually been working with. So we can see that it is a furniture type. So we're going to go ahead and select this from the list. We'll select furniture, and that will bring down the furniture. And then we can take this information here and start typing it into our filter. So kgsim _ workshop NPC, that should filter down low enough. And then we want bed metal lay 01. So bed metal lay 01. And there we go. We press OK. And now our stage item spawn is set up. So now we will have a bed that spawns with this building. So we only had to fill out these 4 fields. It's very painless. It does take a little bit of time, but you can do that for as many different things as you want. So like I said, if you wanted to throw down a dresser there or some random clutter and just create one of these entries for each one, you can absolutely do that. There's no limitations on how many it creates. There is a wonkiness limitation. I'm doing air quotes there, where if you do more than 128 items, the game can struggle to clean them all up correctly when the plot levels up. So I tend to recommend keeping it under 128, but if you're building buildings with 128 items, it's very unlikely that they're not going to, or that you're going to have more than that of statics. And so any of those, the static items, can just be combined into these kind of models here, so that you don't have to hit 128. So most of you should have no excuse for hitting 128 items. I think that the highest that we've gotten in one of our SimSettlements buildings is probably like 30, and that's going to be one of those complex ones that has a quest associated with it. So 128 should be more than any of you will ever need. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and save this, and then we're going to pop into the game, and I will show you how you spawn your building plan to test in SimSettlements. I will tell you right now, before we even do that, you're going to want to denote this number right here. So on your, next to your building plan here, and if you don't see this form ID, you're going to want to stretch this window out so you can see it, but this form ID field, you're going to want to write that down, because we're going to need that once we get into the game. All right, so we're now in the game, and we've got SimSettlements all loaded up. If you're not super familiar with SimSettlements, you'll definitely need to add the holotape and activate it, and then you might want to turn on God mode to make the plots free. Now, I am using Settlement Menu Manager, so that SimSettlements has its own category. If you're not using that, you can find the plots under the special category. And if you've never used SimSettlements before and want a quick way, to get access to everything, you can go under the mod configuration menu if you have that installed. Otherwise, you'd have to add in the SimSettlements holotape manually. But you can go to SimSettlements, and right on the main menu, there's a create holotape option that lets you skip the normal step of having to run to the Museum of Freedom to pick up the holotape, which is what actually activates SimSettlements. So once you've got SimSettlements up and running, you'll be able to do this next step. So what we're going to do here is you can actually build any plot because of the way we're doing this. We're going to test this through console. Because mine's a house, I'm going to put it as a residential just for the sake of making this very clear what we're about to do. But once you've built your plot, you're going to open up the console, and you're going to select the plot by clicking on its power pole, and you should see up at the top there, if you have a mod like Better Console F4SE, you'll have this great little bit of information. I highly recommend that. Otherwise, you might just see the reference ID. So I highly recommend Better Console F4SE for those of you working on this type of thing. Now you'll see I've already typed a bunch of stuff in console, and that's what I want to show you guys. So one of the things that I had you write down there before we got into the game was your form ID. Well, in reality, the first 2 digits of that are going to be dependent on what your load order is right now. So if you know how to figure out load order and you know what load order your new plugin is in, you can just replace the first 2 digits in what you wrote down and you're good to go. But if you don't know that, you can get access to it in the game this way. So what you would do is you would type in the word help and then a space, and then you would put in double quotation marks, you would put the name or part of the name of your building plan. So what you named it on that form. So I remember I named it test house, so I can put that inside of double quotes, and then you're going to type the number 4, which makes sure that the help command is searching through all sorts of different forms. And then we're going to type in MICSC, and we can do that because we know that our building plan is a miscellaneous object type. Now you might not know to do that misc thing, and that's okay. You don't have to include that if you're searching for something else in the console. Just doing, as long as it has the number 4 there, that will find most record types. But we're going to go ahead and type in MISC to narrow it down. And then when we search there, we get our misc record that I can see has the same form ID as it did in the CK of that FA6. So that is the actual full form ID with the load order factored in. So the load order, those first 2 digits, have to do with what order your mod is loaded in. If this is something that's going way above your head, this is a kind of modding 101, like not actually building mods, but playing with mods 101 type of thing that you can read about in a lot of different places. I'd imagine you'll find plenty of tutorials on that by some of the big community people. Like I wouldn't be shocked to see if Gamer Poets had something that explains that all in more detail. But just know that the first 2 digits on that 8-digit hex always have to do with the order that items or that your mods are loaded in. So once you've got your plot selected and we know the full 8-digit ID of our building plan, we're going to run this little console command. We're going to run CF, which stands for call function, and then test building plan, and this is a custom function that's built into Sim Settlements. And then we enter in the name or the hex number, so that 8-digit number of our building plan, and then we press enter. Now that's the first step. So and in this case I missed a number there. I typed in 2 zeros instead of 3, and so it told me down at the bottom there, if you can read that, it said it failed conversion. That's a good sign you screwed something up. So I did, so I just retyped it with the correct number. So then we exit console, and then we're going to assign a settler to this plot. And right now, you'll notice that that particular thing that appeared there, it was not part of my building plan. I had used some basic building materials in my plot. What has happened in this particular case is that Sim Settlements will initially try and assign a building plan before you do. And so if it does that before you run that test building plans, you might find that something else appears for a moment. And then as you can see now, all that stuff's disappearing, and our fence and bricks are appearing as expected, as we planned in our building plan. So if you get something weird appearing, that's just because you were too slow to enter in your console command, and Sim Settlements was already doing stuff in the background while you were in console. So now, after we wait, it takes between 45 and 60 seconds for a building plan to go through its stages. Now, if you had set up multiple stages, it would be, you'd see them transitioning here. In our case, we only have the one, so it's just going to kind of appear all of a sudden at around 60 seconds. So once that passes, we'll see our building appear, and then moments after that appears, the bed should pop into place. And if you had set up multiple stage items, all those would appear in rapid succession. The stage items tend to appear very quickly, whereas the actual models, so these particular things, will fade in and out nicely to try and give you a smoother transition. But as you can see, the bed just popped into existence there. So now we've got our level 1 building, and it's got our bed here. And this is actually a functioning bed. You can actually sleep in it. And the now, if it weren't for the navigation issues the settler's going to run into with this, which we'll cover in a future tutorial, they would actually go in and sleep in that bed. And so that's the benefit of using Sim Settlements over just buildable objects, or one of the benefits, aside from the fact that you can upgrade your buildings, but you can also set it to spawn a whole bunch of different items on top of it when it creates this. So now we've got our nice little building plan, and obviously you should be able to take that information and extrapolate to add more levels to your building, to add more items, and that's the basics of creating plots and creating building plans for them, rather. And we'll go into more detail. We'll show you how to do some of the faster methods in future tutorials. We'll show you how to set up the nav mesh. All that will be covered in this tutorial series over time. So thanks, guys, and good luck making your Sim Settlements buildings.